Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, July 25th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about conference realignment. It feels like we have kind of sidestepped the realignment bug just for the time being, with Clemson and Florida State staying in the ACC through the 2025-26 season. But I feel like there's a landslide on the other side of it, and I'll break down exactly what I mean, how it could likely be the biggest one we have seen yet in the conference realignment world. Then we'll get into kind of a new development in the Connor Stalions case. It sounds like a documentary is going to be made by Netflix. They have kind of done an untold series around some of the biggest stories in sports. This is definitely under that category, so we'll break down exactly my thoughts on it and why I'm a little hesitant about this new documentary. But then we'll get into the Group of Five playoff a little bit. The American Conference Commissioner came out and said that he was very much in favor of a Group of Five playoff to kind of be added into the fold along with the 12-team playoff, and that's obviously a very interesting thing to unpack. So we'll get into that a little bit today before we continue on with where the top contender seasons will be decided. We'll give you 4 games where I'm really circling for these teams to go 4-0, to go 3-1, what have you, but really show that they're big-time championship contenders this year. And then we have some hot takes around the contenders in the Big Ten. We're about to wrap up this segment. We've gone through the Big 12 and the ACC. We'll do the SEC tomorrow, but today we'll focus on the Big Ten and a ton to break down in that conference. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the Tip and Donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's talk about this new realignment stuff, because obviously we got the news that Clemson and Florida State are staying put for the time being in the ACC. They will be in the ACC through the 2025-26 season, and then we'll kind of see what happens from there. It sounds like the Big 12 is the going favorite to kind of get their services going forward after those seasons, so that'll obviously be very interesting to watch. But I tend to look at this as kind of a waypoint in between what is going to be probably a crazy next couple of years. I think we're going to have a little bit of a break here, and it came at the perfect time going into a season that is going to be just off the walls incredible for a million different reasons that actually we'll break down tomorrow. But there's a ton of stuff that's going into this year, and I think we got this break, so to speak, at the very perfect time. But I think on the other side of it, we're going to have an absolutely crazy thing to deal with. And I think they kind of starts with Clemson and Florida State, obviously, with them hypothetically going to the Big 12 and joining that conference, and Big 12 kind of bolstering that a little bit more. We've talked about how aggressive Brett Yormark is going to be. I can't imagine that it would stop at Clemson and Florida State, especially if the ACC started to bleed a couple of more teams as they went a little bit further down the road. So this is obviously going to be the first domino to fall. Clemson and Florida State, those court cases being resolved and them finding a new place to play, likely the Big 12, that's going to be domino number 1, and that'll probably fall at some point in the next 2 years, and then officially will fall at the beginning of the 2026 season. But there's a million other things that can happen because of that, and I think the biggest thing here is the Big Ten is just sitting and waiting, and I think that's the scary part here, is the Big Ten is just sitting back and saying, okay, you guys can deal with Florida State and Clemson. I'm not necessarily super worried about adding them to the fold, especially because they're not AAU members, but once some other teams become available, they're going to jump at the idea. I can almost promise you that. So it's not only about Clemson and Florida State in this scenario where, sure, the ACC would be more than fine if they were only to lose those two, but UNC and Virginia have gotten a lot of smoke around the Big Ten, and the Big Ten kind of looking in that direction. If it was to happen that the Florida State and Clemsons of the world were to step away from the ACC, that gives you the opening to go grab these two teams. And I think these two teams will probably jump at that opportunity because, frankly, there's not a lot of teams that wouldn't jump at the opportunity to leave the ACC for the Big Ten. It's just Florida State and Clemson didn't get that invite. But I think UNC and Virginia absolutely would. And then you kind of have just a rolling ball that would be very, very hard to stop. So I think it would start kind of this big-time landslide in the ACC, and obviously that would add to the other side of things. You know, you have the ACC kind of figured out of who's leaving. they got to add teams back, because at the end of the day, you want to stay viable as a conference. You have to stay above that 15 team moniker in the ESPN contract to keep that alive. And there's been some rumors that the Big Ten is trying to torpedo that anyway. So it'll be really interesting to kind of watch that unfold. But the reality is, maybe they have to go down to the group of 5 level and go find some teams that can fit what they do. Maybe they have to go find, some teams that aren't necessarily as interesting as the Florida State and Clemsons of the world. Maybe it is an App State, a Troy, a JMU, someone like that can kind of add to this. Maybe you sub like a USF for a Miami, and obviously it's not necessarily the fairest trade in the world for the ACC, but it at least keeps them viable, at least keeps them a conference, and at least gives them any seat at the table rather than them entirely crumbling and becoming kind of like the Pac-12, where you feel like you have all these options in the world to kind of, the world is your oyster in a sense, but you don't really. I mean, you only have a couple of teams out there, and that has put them in a really bad position. That could be the reality for the ACC if they're not careful over the next couple of years. So if it does mean adding an App State in the place of a UNC or a USF in the place of a Miami, it's not ideal, but at least gives you a group of 5 conference type feel and gives you a shot at this thing to stay in the conversation. So that's obviously going to be really, really interesting to watch. Excuse me, I apologize. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch the ACC kind of unfold over the next little bit, but that's only a piece of the conversation, right? Obviously, the people going into and out of the ACC is going to be likely the biggest thing that happens. That's likely going to be where we see the biggest movement, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be movement around them, because I think there's going to be a ton. I think it starts with the Pac-12, where you don't really know what they're going to do. These two teams are sitting out there in the Pacific Northwest, and for a long time it felt like they were in a really good spot. It felt like they were almost in a better spot than a couple of the other conferences, including the ACC, because they could kind of go where they please. They could kind of make their own decisions, go about the way that they want to go about it, and they were getting a ton of money from the teams that were exiting the Pac-12 over the next little bit. So it felt like those two teams were in a position where maybe they weren't going to absolutely dominate and be able to just pick and choose where they wanted to go, but there was going to be a landing point. There was going to be a spot where they could get on the off-ramp and actually deal with the issues that are in front of them. That has not presented itself, and frankly, it's gotten further away from that, with the Mountain West not being quite as interested in joining with these two as we once thought they would be. So that's obviously going to be a huge part of this, where the Pac-12's got to make a decision at some point, whether it's joining the Big 12 and kind of maybe not taking the media rights deal for the time being just to get into that conference, or it's merging with the Mountain West and kind of just leaning over to them, getting rid of the Pac-12 moniker, joining the Mountain West, and maybe merging with another big-time conference. Who knows what it looks like for these two schools, but they're going to play a huge part in this next realignment kind of cycle, and it's going to be one of those things that we're going to have to watch really, really closely, because they could totally dictate, how the group of 5 conferences look over the next little bit, with a merger between maybe the American and the Mountain West, which has been kicked around. And there's some different ideas out there, but they definitely hold a lot of power when it comes to what the sport is going to look like in terms of conferences going forward. But I think the biggest thing here is there's teams in that ACC conference that frankly want out but just aren't saying it right now, or at least that's the way I tend to think. I obviously, you don't have too much information, because a lot of this happens behind closed doors, but you have a ton of teams in that conference that would start looking at the door very, very quickly. UNC and Virginia would likely top that list. I think the Big Ten would be just absolutely banging down the door to grab those two out of that conference because of the AAU accreditation, because of the revenue they make behind the scenes, away from football, away from sports in general, with some of the endowments they get and everything in between. These are huge, huge brands, and they absolutely would fit into the Big Ten. And then you have other teams. I think Duke and Miami would probably be the next on the list that would have to find somewhere else to play, because Miami and Duke frankly just don't belong in a conference that is not a Power 4 conference. Both of those entities absolutely deserve to be in the SEC, in the Big 10, in the Big 12, in one of these conferences that is going to mean a lot going into the next little bit. So I can't imagine that they're going to sit there over the next 2 years and watch Florida State and Clemson have one foot out the door, and watch, maybe UNC and Virginia start to flirt with the idea of leaving the conference and moving somewhere else, and not say that they want in on that too. Obviously, there's going to be hurdles to get to that, the same way there are hurdles for Florida State and Clemson, but Florida State and Clemson are opening a door that is going to be really hard to shut because there's going to be a lot of teams pushing it right back open when it's starting to close. So I think that's going to be kind of the biggest thing here is you have two teams right now that the ACC has to worry about more than anything else, right? Florida State and Clemson are the teams that you really have to hone in on and make sure that they are in good shape. But it doesn't mean that's the end-all be-all. It doesn't mean that, there's necessarily an end in sight after those two leave, because the reality is whether it's, the ACC or the Big 12 or the SEC, Big 10, it doesn't matter. There's going to be conferences that are coming after these ACC teams, and there's going to be ones that they're going to want to leave for. I mean, the SEC and the Big 10 are the two that absolutely you'd want to leave for, but if you get 2 years down the road and Clemson and Florida State are making their way into the Big 12, there's no reality, in my opinion, where the ACC would get a bigger cut of that college football playoff than the Big 12, because you just took two big-time names in the ACC and handed them over to the conference that they're fighting for that third spot. So I think it would be really interesting to kind of watch this unfold, but the reality is we've kind of hit a little bit of a lull in this conference realignment stuff. We've hit a moment where we can kind of breathe and focus on football for the time being, which couldn't have come at a more perfect time with fall camp starting and the 2024 season being one of the craziest in the world. But I do think there's going to be a huge landslide right after it. I do think there's going to be a moment over the next 2 years where we realize there's going to be as much change as we have ever seen it. And maybe there's not, a Texas or OU going anywhere. Maybe there's not, these big time moves with the Big Ten adding 4 teams or anything crazy. But there's going to be a lot of movement, whether that's the Group of 5 level, the Power 5 level. There's going to be a lot of movement that's going to define the way we see these conferences going forward and the way that college football is just structured going forward. So there's going to be a lot of questions. Do we have a Power 3 by the time we get to 27? Is it just the Big 12, SEC, and Big 10? That tends to be the way that I think, but hopefully that's not the case, obviously. But then you could also have Group of 5 schools could kind of merge into different conferences. You could have the American and the Sun Belt become one conference together and try to build up themselves a little bit more. So there's a million different things that could happen, but we've hit a little bit of a lull. We've hit a little bit of a off-ramp, but there's definitely a little bit more coming, and it's going to be very, very intense when it does, and I think it's going to be the biggest movement that we've seen. Not necessarily the most impactful with some of the big-time teams moving, but it's definitely going to be the most teams moving. I feel pretty confident about that. But we'll obviously break that down as it kind of unfolds. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a documentary that Netflix is making around Connor Stalions and the sign-stealing scandal that happened at Michigan a year ago or over the last couple of years. And I'll break down exactly why I don't necessarily feel too great about this. But I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about conference realignment and how we've kind of sidestepped it for the time being, but I think on the other side of this is going to be a just crazy storm of realignment that we'll obviously get to as it kind of unfolds. But let's get into our segment 2 here. And let's talk about the documentary that is going to come out around Connor Stalions and the sign stealing scandal that happened at Michigan over the last couple of years. This is something that was released a couple of days ago. The Untold series that Netflix has kind of been producing has been making a lot of waves, especially in the college football world. They made one around Johnny Manziel. They made one around Manti Te'o. They made one around the Swamp Kings, a Florida program from, I believe, 05 to 09. So obviously some big time things in college football history, and this is a big time thing in college football history. So they jumped at the opportunity to make a documentary about it, and it sounds like Connor Stalions is going to be the main figure in it. The quote that kind of was the big time, or the episode description more than anything else, was Connor Stalions shares his side of Michigan's alleged sign stealing scheme and turned him into a viral villain. And that's going to be a very interesting thing to unfold, because obviously, this is a huge story, and obviously it's something that we all want to learn more about. I don't think there's any question that there are a lot of people in college sports that want to know exactly what happened and want to know what is going to happen in the future with Clemson, or with Michigan, and all of this different stuff. But the reality is, this is a really interesting thing and kind of a really dangerous thing that is going on. And it's not to say that Netflix is doing anything wrong by kind of taking this opportunity, because frankly, it's a fascinating story and absolutely one that is going to be really interesting to be told. But there are a number of issues with this, at least from where I'm standing. And I think it starts, for the number one thing that I'm thinking about is, how does this happen while the investigation is going on? How does this happen while the NCAA is still looking into this? Or is the NCAA not really looking into this as aggressively as I think a lot of us would hope they would? But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that I think is just absolutely wild. I've never really understood this, and I think it's something that you're going to have a lot of people that watch this and have really hardline opinions one way or the other about what Michigan did and about the way that it was handled at a Michigan level, NCAA level, what have you. And you're going to have people that come out of this either thinking the NCAA is villains, or Michigan is villains, or Connor Stalions a villain, and they're not going to budge off that. And I think that's the biggest thing here, where you have an active investigation going on around one of the biggest programs in your sport, and we're allowing the guy at the very center of it to speak to the entire country before we figure out what the actual verdict is on this case. So I think that's the biggest thing that I'm worried about, is this could totally alter the way that this case is handled, and could totally alter the way that people see this case being handled. Whether it's, if the NCAA comes down really hard on Michigan, if they paint the NCAA as the villain in this, there's going to be people that are yelling from the mountaintops that the NCAA is taking advantage of this program and doing something disrespectful. And then on the flip side, if they don't do enough, if they're, give them a little slap on the wrist and move on with their day, there's going to be people that are really mad, and they're going to say Connor Stalions did X, Y, and Z, and it's in this documentary, and you didn't take it into account. So I think it just adds an opening for way too many voices to get in on this conversation. This has to be a NCAA investigation. It doesn't have to be an investigation helped by Netflix and helped by all the other people watching this show. It needs to be just the NCAA going about their business, looking into this as deeply as they possibly can, and figuring out what happened. Now, I don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. Frankly, it's a little too quiet for my liking overall, but at the end of the day, it'll be really interesting to see how this kind of impacts the case, because it could totally impact not only the way the case is handled, but the way that people see the case after it's handled. So it's going to be really interesting. The other part of this is something that Brooks Austin brought up on his show, a fantastic UGA mainly reporter, but someone that he was talking about this, and he said, how does he not sign an NDA before he walks out the door? How does the athletic director, the communication, whoever is in charge of that, how do they not make that a priority to happen before he walks out the door? Because the reality is, this guy can open a huge can of worms. If he decides to go against Michigan, which, frankly, if you've seen anything about this guy, he's likely not to do that. But the reality is, he could. He has that ability to entirely blow up Michigan's spot in this point and say, I've just been scapegoated. I've been the guy that they've put all this on, and this was a total thing that went all the way up to the top to Jim Harbaugh. And that could totally impact the way that people see this case, the way it's handled, everything in between. But it's one of the wilder moves to let a guy that has as much power over your program as pretty much anyone at this very moment, walk out that door and be able to sign a contract with Netflix and say, yeah, I'll tell you whatever you need to know, I'll answer your questions, what have you, without having him sign an NDA. I just think it's absolutely crazy. It's one of those things that could be a huge problem for Michigan. But at the end of the day, I'll get back to my big-time worries about this, and my big-time worry about the product overall of this documentary is Netflix has made a lot of really, really good docs. They've made a lot of really interesting things and something that I think are really, really fun to watch. No two ways about that. There are so many really fun things about these documentaries and so many fun things to kind of break down from them. I mean, we hear about Manti Te'o and the craziness that happened around his online girlfriend. That was just a wild story at the time, and getting even more light on it, it was a fantastic documentary. That was so interesting, that was so detailed, and was one that really gave you a lot of clarity about that situation, and it was definitely really, really cool to hear about all that. The other two that they made didn't necessarily do the exact same thing. And it's not to say that they weren't very good documentaries. It's not to say that they weren't very interesting, because they really were. The Swamp Kings one I absolutely loved. I thought was really interesting and watched every second, because it's one of those teams, one of those eras of a program that you want to know just about everything about if you can. And that was the problem that I had with it, was we didn't really get everything that we wanted out of this. And it's not necessarily to say that they did a terrible job of telling the story, but they didn't tell the full story. And I think everyone that watched that understands that that's the case. And it's not necessarily to tear down Netflix by any means, because I understand that it is not easy to make a documentary around some of this stuff, especially when the person of interest is in the documentary, to make it, as detailed and as in-depth as you possibly want it to be. But the reality was, this documentary, as well as the Johnny Manziel documentary that came out around him, the Johnny Football one, both of them kind of just left a lot of meat on the bone. Both of them kind of told a story that, they told a lot of the story, and they told it very, very interestingly, and I absolutely loved both of them. It doesn't mean that it was the full story. And that's the worry here, where you get into a case that is so important, and a case that has so many nuances and has so many nooks and crannies and so many different things to break down in it, and it has a lasting effect on not only, college football, the way that people look at certain players in the past. It could have a direct impact on a program tomorrow and today and for the future of that program going forward. So you have to get this one right. You just have to. One way or the other, Netflix has to tell this story, not from a point of view of, attacking Michigan or attacking NCAA or attacking Connor Stalions. They got to just tell the story as it is. They got to go in depth. They got to figure out, exactly what happened on these visits to other schools and all of this different stuff that we really don't have a concrete answer to. If Netflix doesn't give us that answer, and it's just a story about a guy that, really loved Michigan and wanted to get in on things, and then the NCAA came in and tore him down and made him a scapegoat and made him look like a villain, it's not going to tell the full story. I'm not here to say, Connor Stalions is a terrible person and we should tear him down every chance we get by any means. But it's just to say we have a big-time opportunity to learn a ton about what happened at Michigan and learn a ton about the culture that has been set up at Michigan over the last couple of years, and I don't want to miss that opportunity. I don't want us to go into this documentary thinking we're going to figure out exactly what happened and we're going to learn so many different stuff and there's going to be so much awesome things to kind of unpack from this, and then we get to the end of it and go, that's not the full story. That's not exactly what happened on this thing, and that's exactly how I felt after watching the Johnny Football documentary and the Swamp Kings documentary, where you're sitting there saying, I had fun, I listened, and it was a very, very interesting, fun documentary to watch. It also wasn't the story that I wanted to be told, or at least it wasn't the full story that I wanted to be told. And this one is not only one that, is an interesting story, but it's one that has effects today in college football. It doesn't have effects in the past. It doesn't have, reverse effects of how you see Johnny Football or how you see the Florida teams. It has effects on this Michigan program today, and I don't understand why this is something that, frankly, is being made right now. I don't fully understand why we're going into this with anything but hesitancy, if I'm being totally honest. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that I thought they would wait a little bit longer. I thought it would take a little bit of time for him to get that documentary that I'm sure was coming one way or the other, but I guess it's going to happen right now. And frankly, I can't wait to watch it. I really cannot wait to see what this whole thing is about and see if we get any more details than we already have about this, and at least get to hear from the man himself that was at the very center of this. It'll all be very interesting. There's no two ways about that. But overall, I'm very worried about this. I don't think there's going to be this big time, glass ceiling broken at the end of the day where you look at this and say, man, I learned so much about this Michigan program. I learned so much about what happened behind the scenes, and I know exactly how I feel about this going forward. I think it's still going to leave a lot of gray area, and I don't think it helps really anyone. I don't think it helps Connor Stalions. I don't think it helps Michigan, and I definitely don't think it helps the NCAA investigation into this. So it's one of those things that, yes, I love hearing everything that you can tell me about college football. I will watch pretty much any documentary you put in front of me that is around college football and is detailing something that happened in college football that is really, really interesting. That's why I watch Swamp Kings. That's why I got into Johnny Football. And that's why I watch all of these different documentaries that come out from Netflix. And I will be watching this one. I just worry that this is not going to be the story that we expect it to be. I think it's going to be a part of the story. It's not going to be the full one. And when you have an active investigation open, it's got to be the full one. So I worry that this is going to be a very interesting thing, but not necessarily what it should be or what we want it to be. So that'll be really interesting to obviously unfold. I likely will give a review when it does come out on the 27th and break down, did they do a good job? Did they prove me wrong by telling the full story, or is it exactly as I expected and it's a little bit disappointing? But it'll be really interesting to see all that unfold, and definitely will give us at least a little bit of insight of what was happening at Michigan over the last couple of years. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the college football playoff, and particularly the Group of Five playoff the Group of Five playoff that could be coming around the corner. The American Conference Commissioner came out and said that he was very much in favor of that happening, so a little bit momentum behind it, and that adds some questions to the conversation going forward. So we'll break down exactly what I mean right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Connor Stalions documentary that is going to be coming out on Netflix and how I don't necessarily love it. I definitely think it's going to be very interesting to watch, but I'm worried about what the product is going to be. But it'll be really interesting to watch it, and I'll break it down once it does come out. But let's get into segment 3 here, and let's talk about the American Conference and the commissioner coming out in favor of the Group of Five playoff. This is something that we've talked about a little bit on here, and something that I've been mostly in favor of for the last little bit, and it's changed a little bit over the last couple of years, and I'll get into that throughout this. But when you talk about the Group of Five, you have the American, which tends to be the class of the Group of Five, if you will. That tends to be where the big time teams are and where the team that I tend to believe is going to go into the playoff is going to come from. Then you have the Conference USA, you have the MAC, Mountain West, and Sun Belt. So a ton of good programs out there, a ton of great conferences, and there's a lot to be discussed around those going into this year and going into the next couple of years with the 12-team playoff, because about 4 of those conferences are going to have their conference champions left out of the 12-team playoff field. I can absolutely promise you that. I would be shocked if they got more than one team in on pretty much any year, but especially the very first year. I don't think there's a world where we get 2 Group of 5 teams into this 12-team playoff, and that opens a door. That opens a door for a number of different things to happen, but the American Conference Commissioner seems to be very much in favor of this becoming a reality where they play their own playoff. They don't necessarily have to rely on the 12 team to make all the decisions for them and absolutely, get in on the last second and be able to make noise. They can make their own and possibly break off and do their own thing. So it'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds. I believe when he was breaking this down, he was talking about send the representative to the 12-team playoff, represent us in that level, but also the other four conferences that have their champion, those four will play for a group of 5 title, and that will be a really interesting thing to watch, and I think it's one of those things that I'm really in favor of. I used to not be in favor of, if I'm being totally honest, because I wanted so badly for the Group of 5 and the Power 5 or Power 4 now to stick together and to be one entity all together. But at the end of the day, they're getting further and further apart, and they're getting as far apart as we have seen them in quite some time. And that's the big time worry here, is what happens, when you officially set up a group of 5 playoff and you go into that room with the college football playoff committee, and you have to make the case that you deserve to get that automatic bid into the normal playoff. I don't know if you would hold nearly as much weight. And the other part of this is obviously you got to get a TV deal to sign. That's going to be the biggest hurdle here, is when you have the college football playoff to lean more resources into, is there going to be anyone that's willing to say, yeah, we'll broadcast the group of 5 playoff just because we, think it's worth it? And the scheduling of that would be an absolute nightmare for a number of different reasons in the postseason. But overall, I think it's something that just makes sense. I think it's something that absolutely is a way to give these schools, give these conferences a little bit more of a pedestal to stand on at the postseason, instead of just kind of letting them go by the wayside and letting them be kind of forgotten in the postseason of this sport. And obviously, getting a seat at the 12-team playoff is a huge, huge moniker for this for the Group of 5 going forward, and will absolutely give them at least a shot to be on the national stage. But it won't necessarily give them a shot to do much on the national stage. I think we all tend to agree that once they get there, it might just be a little bit ugly for some of these Group of 5 teams in the playoffs. So, frankly, I think it makes sense. And I moved a little bit more away from a couple of years ago when I said, I really want everyone to be in the same playoff. I really want everyone to be under the same umbrella. I think it's kind of impossible at this very moment. I think there's too much of a gap between the Power 4 and the Group of 5 when you talk about the resources at their hands and the money that they can put into their programs, that it's unrealistic for us to sit here and say that the Group of 5 teams have all the same shot that the Power 4 teams have at winning a national title. And I think we have to be able to give them a little bit of a pedestal to stand on, and maybe it's a little bit of a, consolation trophy, winning a Group of 5 title. Obviously wouldn't feel like winning a college football title by any means, but it would at least give them an idea of, importance in the postseason, and at least give them a little bit of a pedestal to stand on, where they've kind of been knocked down a number of pegs over the last couple of years. So I don't necessarily love it, because I think it leads to the scary reality that I think all of us tend to believe is going to happen anyway, which is the Group of 5 and the Power 4 just being totally different entities, just totally breaking off from each other and being their own thing. And then once you do that, then maybe the Big Ten and the SEC take their ball and play elsewhere as well. But that's a totally different can of worms. But I think it's one of those things that you have to walk a little bit of a tightrope here. You have to make sure that, you're giving the Group of 5 the respect and the admiration and the pedestal that they deserve, but also you're not jeopardizing the sport. You're not, putting the sport in a really bad spot with taking some of these games out of the fold. And obviously, I think there's a number of different ways to kind of do this. I think the biggest thing here is the regular season games between Group of 5 and Power 4 teams is plenty for me. I understand that we love to see, that big time upset like Tulane over USC. That was absolutely awesome to watch and was a really, really fun game. And maybe you could keep that alive in some form or another going forward. But I think the reality is you got to make a world where at least the Group of 5 has something to play for in the postseason. And obviously that team in the playoff will feel really excited and feel really good when their name pops up on Selection Sunday, but then they're going to see the team that they're playing, and it's going to be the team that came up just short in the SEC title or the Big Ten title, and that's going to be a nightmare for them. It's no disrespect to these teams, because there's a lot of fabulous teams down there, but let's be honest, they're playing two totally different sports at this very moment. So I think it could lead to kind of a split between these two entities. It could lead to the group of five being kind of their own thing handled by the NCAA, and then the Power Four being their own thing handled by their own governing body, which would be obviously very interesting and add a lot of ers and ahs into college football. But it's also one of those things that might just be hard to avoid going into the next 5-10 years, where we could keep the American and we could keep the Mountain West and the MAC and all of that intact the way that it is right now. But I don't think it necessarily does them any more good than it would be to break off and be their own entity and have their own playoff. So I think there's going to be a ton of stuff where you have to be able to maybe break off a little bit and have your own group of five playoff. And yeah, Anthony's right. There are rumors that the Big 12, Big 10, SEC, maybe the ACC, but that might be heading for some hard times here. But the reality is, I think that's what they want to do. I think at the end of the day, if you were to put Truth Serum and Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti and Brett Yormark and ask them what they want the setup to be for the playoff, they would say, no auto bids, it's just us in the Big 10, or it's just us, the Big 10 and the Big 12, and we move forward from there. And I think that's what they would say. They would not worry about the group of five teams, and that's a whole other problem that I have with college sports right now, that no one's really concerned about the sport. They're concerned about their conference, but that's a side thing that is very, very frustrating. But overall, I think when you look at this, it's kind of the lesser of two evils in a way. It's kind of, taking what's given to you at this very moment and saying, we're just going to make the best out of a bad situation. If it were me, if I was the one making the decision, I think I would have an 8-team playoff in the Power Four conferences. I think I would have a 8-team playoff in the Group of 5 conferences, and you would have a Group of 5 champion. You would have a Power 4 champion, and likely the Power 4 champion would be your college football champion, quote unquote. But I don't necessarily think it's the worst thing in the world. I don't think it necessarily kills the sport, but it adds a lot of questions. There's no two ways about that, and it definitely is not necessarily the way that I would love to go, but given over the last 5 years, the way that things have gone, it might just be the best way forward at this very moment. So, and Anthony makes a good point. How feasible is it for these two to break off into their own separate entities? For the group of five, it might not be that feasible. Given the amount of money that they have at their disposal, it might not be feasible unless the NCAA is willing to help them out with that transition, and a media deal comes to the table fairly quickly for these entities. But for the Power Four, it wouldn't be an issue, especially the SEC and the Big 10. They could do it tomorrow and be able to set up their own playoff and have their own media deal and all of this different stuff, and it really wouldn't be too difficult. Obviously, you'd have to get out of some contracts and have to deal with some bureaucratic red tape, but when it comes to the facilities and the money that they have to put forward, it would not be a problem for those two entities. I feel very confident about that. But on the other side of things, it might be. The group of five doesn't necessarily have that same ability to say, we're going to take our ball, go play elsewhere, and yeah, we don't necessarily have the money to support all of this stuff at the same time, but we'll find it in time. I think that's not necessarily the reach that they can make, so it'll be really interesting. I think it's one of those things where group of five commissioners might just have to come together and say, maybe we just have to bite the bullet on this one. Maybe we just have to say, yeah, we're second tier and we have to be able to move forward as second tier. Maybe you make a little bit less money. Maybe you don't get necessarily the talent level that you're even getting now with some of the different things that could happen going forward. But at least you have a playoff. At least you have a postseason thing to look forward to. At least you have the sport that you like and the sport that you want to keep playing at that at a really high level and be playing in the postseason. So I think it's one of those things where a group of five team getting into a 12-team playoff is really nice. It's a sweet gesture to give to the group of five and allow them to be in on the party and allow them a seat at the table. It doesn't mean they really have a seat at the table. It just means that they're going to be able to get in and then probably get beat by 30 or 40 points by the SEC or Big 10 runner-up. And it's a sad reality, and I kind of wish that this year a group of five team would turn it on its head and beat someone in the first round, but we'll obviously see if that unfolds. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a consolation prize at this very moment for the group of five getting into that 12-team playoff, because you tend to know what's on the other side of that. And I think that's going to be the biggest thing here, where I get you want to keep the group of 5 a part of the big time playoff, and you want to keep them intact with the Power 4, and that's all well and good, and I tend to be on that side of things. I'd love for that to be the case, but it doesn't necessarily do anyone good if you're giving them a spot in a playoff that they have literally no chance to win. So I tend to believe that we should absolutely be breaking off into different entities. Now, Anthony brings up a good point where maybe the ACC is a part of that group of 5 playoff down the road with all of the different things happening around that. But overall, I just think this is something that pretty much has to happen. If you want to get these group of 5 teams the pedestal that they deserve in the postseason, I think they're frankly better off having their own playoff and playing for a group of 5 title than they are going to the big boy playoff and just getting absolutely railroaded in the first round every single year. So I tend to believe that this is the right way forward. Obviously, there's going to be a back and forth and could impact the way that those college football playoff discussions happen in January and February. But at the end of the day, I tend to be in favor of this, and I think the group of 5 just deserves a little bit more of a pedestal in the postseason than they have right now. But let's take our third break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the top contenders and where their season is going to be decided. We broke down the Big Four, as I call it, yesterday with UGA, Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon. Now we're going to get into 4 more teams that absolutely have playoff aspirations and break down where they're kind of going to be decided one way or the other. So we'll get into that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about kind of a idea of the group of 5 playoff coming into the effect in college football, and I tend to be on the favor of that, but definitely a very, very interesting thing that will unfold. Anthony had a good question over here about the Big Ten and the SEC adding some of these bigger teams in. Would they kick out some of these smaller teams in their conference if they see fit and kind of build up that even more? I think that is something that definitely could happen, but when you look at the bottom feeders in some of those conferences, say Vandy in the SEC, they bring in so much money on the other side of things, on the academic side and the revenue or the research side, excuse me. They bring in so much money on that side of things that I think the SEC would be more than fine to just give Vanderbilt their check, have them get beat every year, and just continue on about their business. And then I think in the Big Ten, you have Northwestern, but you also want that research money. So it's one of those things that obviously if you're looking at this from a football lens, then yes, Vandy and Northwestern and some other ones in those 2 conferences would likely get kicked to the curb for some of the bigger names that could come in, but there's so much more at play, and I think the research dollars that both of those universities have would keep them intact just long enough. So that would obviously be really interesting to watch, but I tend to believe that we're not necessarily staring that down in the face. We could be in a couple of years, but as of right now, I don't necessarily worry about that too much. But let's get into these 4-game stretches. We've been kind of unpacking this over the last couple of days. We got into the Big Four yesterday, the teams that are setting the pace going into this season with UGA, Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon. Now we got 4 other teams for you, and the team I want to start with is Alabama, one of the teams that is probably the most confusing going into this year, and for me it starts at South Carolina on October 12th, and that's kind of a weird starting point, and I understand that, but the reality is there is a lot of things that Alabama has kind of struggled with over the last little bit when you talk about some teams that have gotten under their skin, and a lot of it is when they go on the road, things get just a little bit sketchy for that team for whatever reason. That tends to be what happens, but this one is in your home stadium. You shouldn't necessarily have to worry too much, but when Lenore Sellers is on the other side of the field, you have to be worried at all times. This guy can make a play that can totally change the complexion of a game, and especially when he's throwing the ball to a guy like Nick Harbor, you have to be a little bit more on alert. So I'm not necessarily saying that Bama should have any trouble in this game, and frankly, if they do have a lot of trouble in this game, we might have to look at them a little bit side-eyed for the rest of the season, but it's definitely one that you just got to watch a little bit closer, at least for the first half, and then we'll see what happens from there. And then you get at Tennessee. It's obviously one that is going to have just so much juice. We talked about the Tennessee UGA game yesterday and how going into the season, it feels like it has more energy behind it than it really ever has before, because I think Tennessee is coming into this year thinking, we're not going to be a team that wins 10 games and then just kind of fades off into the abyss. We're not going to be a team that is afraid of the Bamas and the UGAs of the world. We're going to play them on our terms, and we have a chance to beat them. And I think the biggest thing here is you have Nick Saban's gone. The guy that was so scary, the guy that absolutely dominated you for so long, he's gone. And if you feel like you have this, new lease on life if you're Tennessee, and you have the ability to kind of flip this thing on its head. So it's going to be a huge game, and frankly, it's going to be one of those games that totally defines this first season for Kalen DeBoer in Alabama. So, and Anthony, absolutely, dual threat quarterbacks pose problems to pretty much every defense, but for whatever reason, Alabama has been a little bit more susceptible to that. We saw it last year with Jaden Daniels, and if he could get through that game, then it was going to be a problem for Alabama. I can almost promise you that. I don't know if LSU would win, but they definitely might have. But then you go on to Missouri on October 26th. This is a game that I think is going to be really, really interesting for a number of reasons, because I don't know what Missouri is going to be this year. I'm having just a remarkably hard time getting a good beat on Missouri this upcoming year, and I think when you get into games like this is a game where Missouri finally feels like they belong in it. I think there was a long time where Missouri was just scratching and clawing to fight for some of these games, to be, a South Carolina of the world, where maybe you're not going to win 10 games in that year, but you might cause some problems for some teams throughout the year. They now want to compete for a college football playoff. That's the way that they want to go about business, and this is a game where they can pretty much solidify that in a lot of ways. They can say, we're going to be a team that you're going to have to worry about going forward. This would be the best way to send that message. And then you go to LSU. This is always a show. There's no two ways about that. That's always the one that you always want to tune into, and frankly, I think it's one that LSU feels pretty good coming into this one, because although their defense is not great and their secondary is a little bit suspect, so is Alabama's, and you have to worry about that on the other side. And I think Garrett Nussmeier is going to be an absolute beast. We'll talk about that tomorrow, but he's someone that I think is going to absolutely light up offenses, and behind that offensive line, it's going to be hard for Bama to get home, and if they can't get home, it's going to be nearly impossible for them to keep up on the back end. So overall, I think when you look at this game, obviously it doesn't include the UGA game, which is the biggest game for Bama this upcoming year, but this is the stretch where they change, the complexion of their season. If you lose to UGA, then you likely have to go 3-1 in this stretch at the very least. But there's a reality where I see a 1-3 stretch here. I'm not necessarily saying that's what's going to happen. That probably wouldn't be my pick at the end of the day. But when you go to Tennessee, when you play a good Missouri team that has all the momentum in the world, and then you go to LSU, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have some issues at your hands, and maybe you come out of those with losses. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. But then let's move on to Penn State. And I think it starts at USC for a number of reasons, but I think this one's just one of the weirdest games of the entire season. You have a Penn State team going all the way across the country to play a team that they've only really played in the postseason in the Rose Bowl, and it's one of those things that I think you're going to figure out, the real pecking order of this conference in games like this. Penn State, USC, USC, Wisconsin, Wisconsin, Iowa, all those teams right in the middle are going to give you an idea of who's the next up, who's the team that maybe it's not 2024, but 2025 can really make some noise. And Penn State absolutely can make noise in 2024, but they definitely need to set themselves up to say, USC is not going to walk in here and knock us off, or even Oregon is someone that they're going to try to box out as much as they can. But at the end of the day, it's going to be really interesting to see how that one rolls out and how that one kind of unfolds. But then they go to Wisconsin, and that one is very, very interesting for a number of reasons, because Ohio State is lurking right around the corner. And it's really, really hard this year to not be looking towards that Ohio State game the week before. So that Wisconsin game is one where maybe you don't see much in it right now. Maybe you don't see an upset coming there. But when you look around it and you see the big-time game coming up right after this one, you might just be a little bit worried if you're a Penn State fan. But then the Ohio State one is where Penn State can take that next step. It's where Penn State can prove that they are a different team than they have been the last couple of years. And they're not just going to just get absolutely dominated by the two big teams up top and then be able to beat everyone below them, they can compete with everyone in this conference. So it's a huge game for perception. They don't necessarily have to win it, but they got to play much better football than they did a year ago. That's for sure. And then you have Washington to kind of finish out this stretch. And frankly, I think this one they should really roll in. I think this is one that, yes, you will have a Washington team that has kind of gotten rolling over the last, couple of months. It's a little bit later in the season, but overall, if they do not win this one and keep it moving on to maybe a Big Ten championship or maybe even a playoff, they're going to have some problems on their hands. But let's move right along here to Notre Dame, and I think it starts with Louisville, and frankly, this stretch doesn't include the three biggest games on their schedule with A&M, Florida State, and USC, but these are the games that might just define if they get into the playoff, because the reality is this is not a hard schedule, but they could get tripped up by one of these games, and then it totally torpedoes their season. So Louisville is where it starts, and frankly, this is one that I think is the fourth most dangerous game on their schedule, and Jeff Brom is one of those guys that any given Saturday could play just elite football and play with pretty much anyone in the country. So it'll be really interesting. Obviously, we'll know so much more about this Louisville team once that game does come around, but I think this is the one, especially of this list, that is the most sketchy, and if they do lose it, then they definitely do have a problem on their hands. Stanford, frankly, is a layup. No disrespect to the Cardinal, but the reality is Notre Dame, if they don't walk in there and win by 10, 14, 21 points, they have a really big problem. And if they don't hold Stanford to 10, 14 points, they have a really big problem on their hands. And then you go to Georgia Tech. I think that's the one that I'm circling where this one could get sketchy. I'm not necessarily saying that Georgia Tech is going to outright beat Notre Dame, but Notre Dame is in this stretch of the season at this point where they feel a little bit momentum, especially if they've beaten that A&M team. They're going to be going into this with a lot of energy and a lot of juice, but the reality is it's going to be really interesting to see this kind of unfold because this is not going to be a team that is going to hand you stuff. Georgia Tech is so good at spreading out defenses and making them be off kilter and making them be on their back foot that Notre Dame, although they have an incredible defense, they're not going to stop this team from scoring. They might be able to stifle them a little bit, but they're not going to outright stop this team from scoring. And if on the other side of the ball they have some trouble at wide receiver and quarterback and some of the issues that could pop up throughout the year, you might just have a game on your hands that totally ruins Notre Dame's season before they even really get going. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Anthony, I believe he's going into his second or third year as the full-time head coach. He went 9-3 or 9-4 in his very first year, but I don't know if he had the interim tag during that year. And then last year had a 10-win season, and so I believe it's his third year. I could be wrong. Navy, he brings up a great point because the reality is Navy plays a game that no one else plays. At this very moment, Navy plays the style of triple option that Air Force and Army have gotten a little bit further away from. Navy is pretty much still a big-time option team. They definitely have spread it out a little bit more, but the reality is this is a game that obviously Notre Dame should walk in and absolutely dominate. If you're looking at this on paper, it's absolutely no problem, but if you want to go back and watch some of the triple option teams beat teams that are just far better than them, you're more than welcome to, because there are a number of examples from that Paul Johnson Georgia Tech era where they walked into a game against a Georgia team that was better at literally every single position and by a comfortable margin, and then they just outright beat them by getting on the edge, by making them confused with all of the different movements that they had. And the triple option is one that no one can defend. They can do their best to slow it down, they can do their best to stop it as best they can, but you're never going to fully stop it because there's too many variables to keep track of, especially with a quarterback that can run it really well. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, and one of those games that it's not necessarily overly, interesting. It's not necessarily one that you're circling, but it's one that could be trouble for Notre Dame. But let's get into Florida State here, and this is the most interesting stretch of the bunch to me because Memphis starts this one on September 14th, and it's really early in the season, and I think it's one of those games where Memphis is a really good team. They're not just a good group of 5 team. They're a team that could absolutely play in the SMU role, be in that kind of ACC and maybe make some noise in that conference this year. If they were in that conference, well, they at least get a shot at one of those teams in that conference, and it's the one that they want a shot at in Florida State. So I think this could be a moment where Memphis sees what's in front of them. They see a chance to have that, program-changing moment, and they take it. I think this is a very dangerous game for Florida State, and obviously them coming down to Tallahassee helps a ton, but at the end of the day, it's going to be so interesting to watch this game unfold. And then you have Cal. This is one that, frankly, is the easiest of the bunch here by a pretty comfortable margin. The one variable here is Jay Knott is on the other side of the field, and whenever he is someone that can win a game by himself. So that's obviously the big-time worry for this team. And then you get into an at SMU game that, frankly, I think is so interesting. I think this is one of those games that could totally ruin the what Florida State wants to do this year and totally flip the entire ACC on its head, because they got to go all the way out to Dallas to play a game. I get they go all the way up to Syracuse and they do that type of thing, but this is a totally different game. SMU sold this thing out yesterday, so they are plenty prepared for this game, and they absolutely want to come into this conference with a bang, and this would absolutely be the way to do it. So I think this is the game where if you were to circle one on Florida State's schedule where you say that one could be the place that their entire season kind of gets blown up, that would be the one that I would circle. And then you got Clemson right around the corner, which is another reason why that SMU game is so sketchy, because like the last 3 years, this is going to define their season. One way or the other, if they win or they lose, this is going to be the game that they look back on and say, that was the difference maker of us making the ACC title, making the playoff, what have you. But at the end of the day, I can't get a beat on any of these teams. Either of these teams are so hard to figure out how good they're going to be, where they're going to be good. I know Florida State's going to have a good defense. I know Clemson's going to have a good defense. I have about a million questions on the offensive side of the ball for both teams. So I don't really know how that game's going to go, frankly. I think this is the stretch where we're going to find out, is Florida State the team that we expect them to be after a fantastic 2023, or is DJ and some of these transfers that they brought in just not enough to get them where they wanted to go this upcoming year? And we'll really figure out in that SMU and Clemson game, because both of those are ones that they could absolutely lose if they're not careful. But let's take our final break here. When we come back, we're going to get into hot takes around some of the contenders in the Big Ten. A ton to break down in those, so we'll go ahead and take our break and be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the biggest 4-game stretches for some of the teams that have national title hopes this upcoming year, where it'll be decided, are they a national title team, or are they just a team that we thought were going to be a national title team and never really came to fruition? So obviously it will be really interesting to watch that, but let's get into some hot takes around the conference contenders, and it's the Big 10's turn, and frankly, if you were to ask me who are the teams that could actually win this conference, I would have about 4 names for you, but I have 6 here that I want to break down, and I might just be tipping my hand a little bit of what my rankings will be next week, but we'll get into that, obviously, once it comes around. But let's get into this, and let's break down some of these hot takes, and it starts with Ohio State. I think TreVeyon Henderson is comfortably going to be the feature back at Ohio State. I understand they brought in Quinshon Judkins, and I understand he is one of the best running backs in the entire country. I think TreVeyon Henderson has the ability to be the best in the entire country. And I understand injuries have been a big-time trouble for him. But when I watched this kid back in the day, he came in as a freshman and really just lit the world on fire. There was comparisons between him and Bijan Robinson, who turned out to be a top 10 pick in the draft and one of the best running backs we've seen in recent history in college football. And he's someone that has that ability. I understand that is very, very lofty goals and a very lofty comparison, but the reality is there's not a lot of things on the football field this kid can't do. He can run in between the tackles. He can do the outside zone if you really absolutely need him to. He can run stretch plays, pitch. He can absolutely get out on the edge and catch a couple of passes and make some guys miss. He is physical and shifty. He does literally everything you want a running back to do. And frankly, if he stays healthy, I think he's the most dangerous player on this entire team. They have a million different skill position players and dangerous players on both sides of the ball, honestly. But this guy is just a different level than everyone else, if I'm being totally honest. I think he absolutely has the ability to be the biggest player for that team and be the guy that we look back on this Ohio State season and see a national title and see a Big Ten title. And then you also see a Doak Walker Award winner in TreVeyon Henderson. Obviously, splitting snaps is going to be a little bit interesting with him and Quinshon Judkins and how that kind of unfolds. But if you're asking me who's going to be the guy that they trot out no matter what the situation is, it's going to be him. And he's going to be a guy that can catch passes out of the backfield, which is really the biggest difference maker if you were to ask me, especially with Will Howard at quarterback. You're going to need a guy that he can just dump the ball off to and can get 5, 7, 10 yards at any given moment. So I think this offense is really good in a number of different ways. I think this guy is the one that takes them over the top and makes them just outright one of the best in the entire country. So I love TreVeyon Henderson. I tend to believe, if you were to ask me, all things equal, everyone's on the field for 12 games of the entire season. I think this is the running back that I would choose number 1 overall. I understand that sounds a little bit crazy given the year that Ollie Gordon had a year ago, but I really think this kid is special, and I think as long as he's on the field, he's going to do some things that will make your jaw drop this upcoming year. But let's move on to Oregon, and I think Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson will both top 1,000 yards. And frankly, this one isn't quite as hot as it seems because they had 2 1,000-yard receivers a year ago with Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson. They replaced Troy Franklin with Evan Stewart, and frankly, I think they got better at that position. I think Troy Franklin is a fantastic player and will do really, really good things at the NFL level, but Evan Stewart is different to me. I think Evan Stewart is the guy that totally opens doors. I don't have to worry about Tez Johnson because he's an absolute beast, and frankly, I would be a little bit surprised if he didn't get to 1,000 yards this upcoming season. But Evan Stewart's the one where I think he's so good. I think he's one of those guys that he comes from that Jimbo Fisher offense over in A&M, and frankly, it was bad. I'm going to be as respectful as I possibly can, but excuse me. The Jimbo Fisher offense held back his wide receivers. There's really no other way to put it. They added so many really talented wide receivers between him and Chris Marshall and a number of other guys, and then they really had nothing to show for it. And as someone like Evan Stewart, who even made a number of really good plays in that offense, was being held back by that offense. So now he's up in Eugene, and he has Will Stein at his hip, and I frankly think this kid could be a first-round pick this upcoming year, and Tez Johnson could go not too far after him, frankly. So I think this is going to be an incredible group. I think Dylan Gabriel is frankly just a more complete passer than Bo Nix was a year ago. Bo Nix was a fantastic passer, but I think Dylan Gabriel is going to be able to hit some of those deep shots with a little bit more consistency. And frankly, I just think Evan Stewart's bag is just remarkably deep, and he can make every single play on the field. So I really like this duo. It's one of the best, maybe the best in the entire country, and will be very dangerous this upcoming year. And then let's move on to Michigan, and it's the weirdest thing in the world, but I think the O-line will keep Michigan from the college football playoff. I know that sounds a little bit crazy when you go back over the last couple of years of Michigan football and see the O-lines that they had. It was ridiculous. And frankly, for a lot of this offseason, I've leaned towards the side of they'll be fine at that position. They'll be able to figure out and be able to compete with pretty much any team in the country. To this is kind of a real problem that they're going to have to deal with. And frankly, I think it's going to be a good unit. I don't necessarily think they're going to be outright bad. I don't think they're going to be not good enough to compete with some of the teams in the Big Ten. I just think they won't be able to compete with the teams that they absolutely have to. Whether it's Texas or Ohio State or Oregon, I don't necessarily think that replacing 6 guys on your offensive line that made starts a year ago is the best way to go about business and is the way that you're going to be really, really successful this upcoming year. So although that's been the calling card for Michigan, although that's been the thing that everyone has said, at least we can hang our hat on, we're going to have a really good offensive line. And frankly, I think they're going to have a top 20, 25 offensive line. I just don't think that's going to be enough. I think there's going to be defensive lines that come through there, including Texas, which is a little bit sketchy at this very moment, but frankly, I think is going to be much better than people expect it to be, and they're going to make some noise, and they're going to create some problems for you. So I think it's one of those things that their O-line is going to be good. I don't think they're going to be a college football playoff level O-line, and they're going to get exploited by just enough teams to make it to where they just don't quite make the cut for the playoffs. So obviously a really weird one considering how dominant they've been at that position, but I just think when you're losing 6 guys, it's going to be nearly impossible to play the level of football you need to play on that line of scrimmage. But let's move on to Penn State, and this is where I would cut the contenders if I were to be honest here, but there's 2 more I have for you after this. But Penn State, they will make the playoff, but it'll be another Penn State season. It'll be another season where they walk in and they play really good football against West Virginia and really good football against Indiana and really good football against Wisconsin. And then they play really bad football against Ohio State. And they avoid Oregon and Michigan, which is absolutely huge for this team. So they could go 11-1. They could make a Big Ten title this upcoming year. But at the end of the day, I don't see this as a team that can that can compete with the Ohio States of the world, that can make the plays that they need to make against the Oregons of the world down the stretch. So I understand that this is going to be a good team. I think they're going to be a better team than they were a year ago, and I think they're going to make the playoff. I don't think they're going to go much further than that, and you're going to ask the question, is that a step forward? I tend to believe, I guess it is. I don't necessarily know if it's that big of a step forward where, yeah, you made the playoff, yeah, you went 11-1, but you still got dominated by the team that you always get dominated by. You still got dominated by the big-time team that you play in the playoff, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. You get into the playoff, you do the thing that you've wanted to do around there for quite some time, but you also still have that Penn State season that has been just remarkably annoying for a number of Penn State fans over the last little bit. So it'll be really interesting to watch that one. I think they have a ton of variability this upcoming season, but I tend to believe they're just going to be Penn State once again. But at the end of the day, would love to see them take that another step. But let's get into USC, and let's talk about this defense. I think they're going to be top 70 in the country, and that sounds like a cold take, but considering how bad they were on the defensive side of the ball a year ago, I think they're definitely going to be a bunch better. And I think some of it has to do with the personnel. More of it, in my opinion, has to do with D'Anton Lynn. I think he's just so good at game planning and scheming and play calling that he's going to put these guys in the right position to succeed. And when you have guys like Bear Alexander, he's not going to be doubled nearly as much with some of the other guys they had on that interior. Anthony Lucas and Jameel Muhammad are both guys on the edge that really can be disruptive. They can make some plays on that edge, and if they take a step forward from a year ago, they could be a problem. There's no two ways about that. You added guys like Easton Maricanas Arnold, Kamari Ramsey, Akili Arnold, really talented guys on that in the middle and the back end of that defense that I think just makes it more dangerous. And then D'Anton Lynn being able to elevate that defense the way that he was with UCLA, I just expect them to be a little bit more stout than people expect. Now, I think they're going to get, dominated by the Oregons of the world, the Ohio States of the world, maybe the Michigan game. They won't necessarily look too great, but I do think they are a team that can make more plays than some people expect them to make, and definitely can play defense that, isn't great, but it's passable, and it gives you a chance to win some of those big-time games, and maybe, just maybe, get you into a playoff. I tend to believe no, but who knows? At the end of the day, anything could happen. But at the end of the day, let's get into Nebraska, and I think they're going to be undefeated walking into the Columbus, Ohio for that Ohio State game. And it seems like this one is a hot one. It's really not. The Nebraska absolutely will be favored in every single game rolling up to that one. Colorado, Rutgers, and Indiana are the ones that really are the only ones that I'm worried about remotely, and Colorado is the only one that I think could walk out with an actual win. I think Rutgers is a really good team and could be dangerous. I think Indiana is absolutely one that is going to be kind of a thorn in the side for someone this upcoming year, and it could be Nebraska, but overall, that Colorado game, if you win that one in week 2 and don't walk into the Ohio State game undefeated, I think you might just have a little bit of a problem on your hands. Now, after that Ohio State game, it's an absolute nightmare. You play at Ohio State, obviously, and then you go to LA for back-to-back games. You do get a bye in between, but they play UCLA, and then they go right back to play USC, which cannot be the easiest thing in the world by any means. And then they take on Wisconsin before they wrap it up at Iowa. So, frankly, they could walk into that game undefeated and still walk out with 4 or 5 losses on the season. But at the end of the day, the momentum, the energy around that program at that very moment would just be absolutely incredible. So, I think it's one of those things that it's definitely a hot take. It's definitely something that will get Nebraska fans excited, but what really matters is what happens after that Ohio State game, and I'm not necessarily sure it's going to be quite as pretty as some Nebraska fans hope. But overall, all of that stuff is going to be really, really interesting to watch. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We just have incredible people doing really, really good work across every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.